قبل عقدين من الزمن، بدأت منظمة غير ربحية محاولاتها لإصلاح هذا الوضع، ليس بإنشاء حديقة وطنية جديدة، بل بمحمية طبيعية ضخمة تدار بشكل خاص. مكان، كما ذكرنا لأول مرة في خريف العام الماضي، يمكن فيه لقطعان البيسون أن تتجول بحرية من جديد.
في عام 2019 أطلق العلماء 5000 ثور بيسون في أرض
legendary American prairie and more like the surface of another planet. Cracked earth, brittle brush, a wind that carried away topsoil instead of seeds. For decades, ranchers, agronomists, and government land managers threw everything they had at this ground. Bulldozers, imported grass seed, irrigation canals, chemical treatments. And the land refused every single one of their offers. It just kept dying quietly year after year until almost everyone who worked had accepted that this particular corner of Texas was simply gone for good. Then, in a decision that struck most professional conservationists as reckless bordering on irresponsible, a coalition of ecologists and private landowners did something nobody expected. They didn't bring in more machines. They didn't spend another decade drafting incremental pilot studies. They opened the gates and let thousands of bison walk out onto land that, by every conventional metric, should not have been able to support them. What happened next didn't just surprise the people who designed the project. It rewrote entire chapters of how scientists think about ecological repair, and it's forcing a conversation that the ranching industry, the climate world, and conservation science are all still trying to catch up with. To understand why this experiment mattered, you first have to understand exactly how far this land had fallen. What is now the Texas Panhandle was once part of the tall grass and mixed grass prairie system that stretched from Canada down to the central United States, one of the largest, most productive grassland ecosystems that has ever existed on Earth. It held soil so rich that early surveyors described roots reaching a dozen feet into the ground, an underground forest holding the whole landscape together. That system didn't collapse overnight. It eroded, quite literally, over a century and a half of livestock grazing patterns that never resembled what the land had evolved with. Cattle, unlike the animals that shaped this ecosystem for thousands of years, are picky eaters. Given open range, they gravitate toward the same nutritious grasses again and again, clipping them down before they can recover, while ignoring the tougher, less palatable plants nearby. Cattle also don't like to move very far from water. They loiter near creeks and stock tanks, wearing bare patches into the earth, while the far corners of the pasture go untouched and gradually fill in with woody brush that no rancher planted and nobody particularly wanted. Into that gap moved honey mesquite, a tough, deep-rooted, thorny tree that thrives precisely where grass has been weakened. Mesquite isn't inherently a villain. In its native range and balance, it plays a role. But without the pressure that once kept it in check, it spread unchecked across the panhandle, drinking up the shallow groundwater and shading out the last remnants of native grass. By the early 2000s, land surveys in parts of this region were reclassifying what had once been productive rangeland as semi-arid scrub. The soil scientists who studied it found something more troubling than dead grass on the surface. They found that the organic matter buried in the dirt itself, the dark, living substance that lets soil hold water and feed roots, had been quietly draining away for generations. The ground wasn't just bare. It had lost its capacity to support life even if the plants came back. Millions of dollars went into trying to reverse it anyway. Mechanical mesquite removal, reseeding programs, irrigation infrastructure. Nearly all of it failed, or worked only for a season or two before the underlying problem reasserted itself. The land, as one soil scientist involved in the project later put it, wasn't missing plants. It was missing a process. And nobody could buy that process at a hardware store. The plan that eventually got greenlit sounded, to allow experienced range managers, less like science and more like a gamble. Instead of a cautious trial, 100 animals on a fence test plot, monitored for 5 years before any expansion. The organizers proposed releasing thousands of American bison across more than 100,000 acres of this damaged land, essentially all at once. The pushback was immediate and, frankly, reasonable. Conventional restoration ecology treats scale as risk. The bigger the intervention, the bigger the potential disaster if it goes wrong. If the land was already struggling to support a modest number of cattle, how exactly was it supposed to feed thousands of much larger animals? Several range scientists predicted the bison would strip, what little vegetation remained within a single season, accelerating the very collapse the project was meant to reverse. Local ranchers, many of whom had watched their own land decline despite careful management, were openly skeptical that this wasn't going to end in disaster on a much bigger scale. But the scientists behind the project were working from a different hypothesis, one rooted in exactly how this ecosystem had evolved in the first place. Prairie grasses across North America didn't develop in isolation. They developed for millions of years alongside massive herds of grazing animals, bison chief among them, that moved, grazed hard, and left. The theory was that a grazing pressure below a certain threshold simply wouldn't trigger the biological response the land needed. Half a herd, they argued, might produce essentially none of the benefit of a full one. If they were going to test whether bison could reverse decades of decline, they needed animals in numbers that behaved like an actual historical herd, not a token gesture. From the very first weeks, it became clear that bison and cattle interact with land in almost entirely different ways, despite superficially resembling each other. Where cattle wander and nibble, bison move in large, dense, restless groups, grazing an area intensively and then moving on, sometimes miles in a single day. Watching from a distance, the effect on the vegetation looked almost violent. Grass chewed down the crown, ground churned by thousands of hooves. Mesquite saplings rubbed raw as bison used the trunks to scratch dust and insects out of their thick coats, rocking smaller trees until their shallow root systems gave way entirely.
To an outside observer unfamiliar with prairie ecology, it looked like the herd was finishing off whatever was left of the vegetation. To the land itself, it turned out to be closer to resuscitation. Native prairie grasses carry an evolutionary memory of exactly this kind of pressure. Being grazed hard and fast doesn't kill a healthy prairie grass. It triggers it. The plant responds to the loss of its leaves by pushing more energy underground, deepening its root system and storing more carbon below the surface, where it's protected from fire, drought, and future grazing. Mesquite, by contrast, never evolved any defense against this kind of relentless, large-bodied pressure. Its root system is comparatively shallow, and its seedlings are fragile. In the areas where the herd concentrated most intensely, researchers recorded mesquite coverage dropping by roughly a third within the first year alone, a scale of clearing that would ordinarily require expensive machinery and years of follow-up treatment. Then there was the sheer volume of what the herd left behind. A single adult bison can produce tens of pounds of waste daily. Multiplied across a herd numbering in the thousands, that adds up to well over 100,000 pounds of natural fertilizer distributed across the landscape every single day. Not concentrated and trucked away as it would be on an industrial feedlot, but scattered unevenly across hundreds of square miles in a pattern that mimics exactly how nutrients moved through this ecosystem before it was fenced and farmed. That waste doesn't just sit there. It becomes food for dung beetles and other insects, which aerate and mix it into the soil, for fungal networks that break it down further, and for the bacteria that ultimately convert it into nitrogen and other compounds the surrounding plants can actually use. One of the more surprising elements of bison behavior turned out to matter enormously. Wallowing. Bison roll on bare ground to cool off, shed loose fur, and dislodge biting insects. And in doing so they carve shallow depressions into the earth, typically several feet across. Multiply that behavior by thousands of animals moving across the landscape year after year, and you end up with an entire terrain pockmarked by these small bowl-shaped basins. Individually, a wallow looks like nothing more than a dusty dent in the ground. Collectively, across 150,000 acres, these depressions functioned as an informal water harvesting network. Rain that would otherwise sheet off hardened, compacted soil instead pooled in the wallows and lingered, giving the surrounding ground time to actually absorb moisture rather than losing it to runoff and evaporation within hours. That lingering moisture appears to have done something else too. Ecologists studying the American plains have long known about what's sometimes called the seed bank, native grass and wildflower seeds that can remain dormant in soil for decades, sometimes over a century, waiting for the right combination of conditions to germinate. In the areas surrounding the new wallows, plant species that hadn't been documented in this part of Texas since the mid-20th century began reappearing, seemingly out of nowhere. Within roughly half a year of the bison's arrival, Botanists surveying the property were finding native grasses and wildflowers that no modern vegetation survey of the region had recorded. The physical numbers backed up what the botanists were seeing on the ground. Soil compaction across the property dropped substantially within the first year, as bison hooves broke apart the hardened crust that decades of drought and cattle traffic had left behind. Within a year and a half, overall vegetation coverage had climbed dramatically from roughly a third of the land to nearly two-thirds. Native species like blue grama and buffalo grass spreading in a way that field researchers described as unlike anything they'd seen in a comparably degraded landscape. Satellite monitoring of the vegetation change was, at one point, flagged internally as a possible sensor or processing error, because the rate of recovery fell so far outside the range that existing restoration models had predicted. As grass cover returned and the soil began holding water instead of shedding it, the effects didn't stop with plants. Before the bison arrived, this land supported very little wildlife, an occasional coyote, a hawk hunting lizards over otherwise empty ground. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the quiet of an ecosystem that no longer had enough food or shelter to sustain much of anything. A herd of several thousand large grazing animals is, among other things, a continuous source of nutrients for everything above it on the food chain. Not every calf born into a herd this size survives its first winter, and the carcasses that result, grim as that sounds in isolation, became a steady food source that this land hadn't seen in generations. Scavenger and predator populations responded almost immediately. Coyote numbers roughly tripled within the first year. No longer scattered, hungry individuals but established, denning packs raising young near a reliable food source. Sightings of golden eagles increased sharply, and black vultures began appearing in numbers that local wildlife biologists had never documented in the region before. The presence of predators changed more than just the wildlife tally. It changed the behavior of everything beneath them. With coyotes and raptors patrolling the property, smaller herbivores like rabbits and ground squirrels could no longer afford to sit in one place and graze a single patch down to nothing. Constant movement meant no single area took continuous pressure, giving grass the recovery time it needed to grow taller and root deeper. Ecologists have a name for this ripple effect running from the top of the food chain down to the dirt: a trophic cascade. It's the same basic mechanism that researchers famously documented after wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone in the 1990s, where changed elk behavior indirectly reshaped river courses by allowing streamside vegetation to recover. What was happening in the Texas Panhandle looked like the same principle, playing out on dry grassland instead of a mountain river system. By the second year, mountain lions had been documented on the property, animals that require enormous territory and a reliable, complex prey base, and which simply do not wander into degraded, empty landscapes. Insect surveys told a
similarly dramatic story. Recorded species counts climbed from under 50 to several hundred within 3 years, as native bees and butterflies returned to wildflowers blooming in and around the bison wallows. And after decades of running dry, some seasonal streams on the property began to flow again, as soil that had regained its structure started acting like the sponge it was always meant to be, absorbing rainfall instead of shedding it, then slowly releasing it back into the water table. Perhaps the most consequential finding to come out of this project has less to do with wildlife and more to do with climate. Public conversation about ecological restoration tends to center on trees, something visible, countable, photographable. But a healthy prairie may actually outperform a forest in one critical respect: durability of carbon storage. Grasslands store the overwhelming majority of their carbon underground, in root systems that can reach 10 feet or more into the soil. When prairie fires sweep through, as they have naturally and regularly for as long as the ecosystem has existed, those roots survive largely untouched, and the carbon stored within them stays locked in the earth. Forests don't have that same resilience. When a forest burns, much of the carbon stored in standing wood is released back into the atmosphere within days. Soil carbon, by contrast, can remain stable and buried for centuries, so long as the ecosystem above it stays reasonably intact. Before the bison arrived, this particular stretch of Texas wasn't storing carbon. It was leaking it, as eroding, dying vegetation and bare ground gradually released what little organic carbon remained in the soil. Once the herd took hold, that trend reversed. Soil sampling across the property within 2 years showed a substantial increase in stored carbon, enough that the research team initially assumed some kind of equipment or lab error and had portions of the sampling redone before accepting the results. Extrapolated across the full acreage, researchers estimated the restored grassland was pulling tens of thousands of tons of carbon out of the atmosphere annually, done not through any manufactured carbon capture technology, but through the simple, repeated biological act of grazing, trampling, and returning nutrients to the soil. The mechanism is elegant precisely because it's so basic. When a bison bites down the top growth of a grass plant, the plant compensates by directing more energy into its root system. Those roots are built almost entirely from carbon the plant has already pulled out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis. When older roots die back and decompose, that carbon becomes part of the stable organic matter in the soil, locked away, out of the atmosphere for the long term. Every grazing bite, in effect, drives a small amount of atmospheric carbon back underground. The scale of what one herd accomplished on one property naturally raises an uncomfortable, much bigger question. The Great Plains once covered roughly 500 million acres across North America, and a substantial share of that land today shows the same warning signs as Texas property displayed before the bison arrived. Compacted soil, retreating grass cover, and a slow but steady drift toward the kind of collapse that produced a dust bowl nearly a century ago. If restoring bison to even a modest fraction of that land, something on the order of 10%, produce comparable results, the cumulative effect on regional water cycles, carbon storage, and biodiversity could be substantial enough to matter well beyond any single state's borders. That question runs directly into the reality that the Great Plains are not empty land, waiting to be rewilded. They are home to generations of ranching families and an agricultural economy that feeds a significant share of the country. Nobody involved in this project frames ranchers as the villains of the story. They're operating within a grazing system that was, for most of the 20th century, presented as a responsible and modern way to manage rangeland. The trouble is that the system, as widely practiced, doesn't replicate what bison do instinctively. The movement, the grazing intensity, the recovery windows between visits to the same ground. Some ranch operators are experimenting with intensive rotational grazing methods designed to mimic those historical patterns more closely, moving cattle through smaller paddocks far more frequently than traditional open-range grazing allows. Early results from these approaches are promising, though even their strongest advocates acknowledge that managed cattle can only approximate, not fully reproduce, what a genuinely wild migratory bison herd does on its own. What makes this story land differently than a typical conservation success is the timeline. Ecological restoration is usually described in terms of decades. Patient monitoring, incremental gains, uncertain outcomes measured against a backdrop of continued loss elsewhere. What happened on this stretch of Texas rangeland compressed that timeline dramatically, not through any new technology, but by restoring a relationship between animal and land that had simply been missing for a century and a half. It's a useful corrective to an instinct many people share, the assumption that a large-scale environmental problem automatically requires a large-scale technological solution. Here, the most effective intervention wasn't a machine or a chemical treatment or an engineered system. It was returning an animal to a landscape it had shaped for millions of years before it was ever fenced off. The land, in a very real sense, didn't need to be taught anything new. It needed the one thing that had been taken away from it, given back. Whether this approach can or should scale up across the rest of the Great Plains remains an open and genuinely difficult question, tangled up with economics, land ownership, and the livelihoods of the people who already work that ground. But what happened on this 150,000 acres of Texas scrubland makes a hard case that the tools for repairing some of the most damaged land in North America may already be walking around, largely unused, waiting for someone to open the gate.